everybody, happy Harloween and welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about one of my favorite spooky, historical Halloween events. October 30th, 1938 was a typical Sunday evening for many people across the United States. Sunday evenings were usually a time to unwind from the weekend and relax before another busy week of work and school began. And in Depression-era America, there was no better way to do this than to settle into a comfortable chair or sofa and turn on the radio set. These were tense times, times of unemployment and uncertainty, with bad luck around every corner. Many hardworking Americans had already lost their jobs and even their homes when the Great Depression had started 9 years prior, and those on the East Coast, from New York through New England, had been blindsided just the previous month by one of the most destructive and powerful hurricanes in recorded history, a hurricane that killed 700 people and destroyed thousands of homes and businesses. And if that wasn't enough to keep a person up at night with worry and anxiety, there was also a war brewing in Europe, and a seemingly unstoppable dictator named Adolf Hitler, who had been steadily strengthening Germany's military, invading Austria the previous March, and pushing into Czechoslovakia in early October. Too many Americans remembered, all too well, the chaos and destruction that World War I had caused just 20 years before, and now it looked like the world was on the cusp of another battle that would once again tear nations apart and bring death and destruction to everyone's front door. It felt like the world out there was a dark and scary place, and people needed a distraction just so they could keep going. In the Roaring '20s, there had been plenty of money and time for going out to dinner and spending an evening at the movies, but once the stock market crashed, most American families didn't have a lot left over for leisure activities after paying the bills. Nearly 1/3 of movie theaters closed between the years of 1929 and 1934, so people chose to stay at home, amusing themselves with board games like Scrabble and Monopoly, and of course, listening to the radio. In 1916, radios were selling for between $35 and $200, a steep price. But by the early 30s, the price had dropped to an average of $10, and therefore most middle-class American families owned one by 1938. And the radio not only provided a distraction from the current state of the world, but it also filled the much-needed gap of social interaction, with neighbors often gathering in one home to listen to their favorite programs together. The radio was so important to American life in the 30s that, quote, while movie houses closed, nightclubs languished, and theatrical stock companies disappeared, radio boomed. Thousands of families who had purchased much of their household equipment on credit gave up their vacuum cleaners, their cars, and their furniture, but kept up payments on their radios, end quote. They would listen to music, but there were also radio programs performed live by actors in a studio. If you were in the mood for comedy, you could tune in every week to the Amos and Andy Show. If you were feeling like a soap opera love story, you could listen to Our Gal Sunday, a serialized story of a small-town girl who falls in love with a wealthy Englishman. For those who needed a little drama in their lives, The Lone Ranger and the Shadow were sure to satisfy, and young children could tune in to listen to the adventures of Little Orphan Annie every week. And for the first time in history, Americans could hear their president's voice in their own homes. Between March of 1933 and June of 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt talked conversationally to the American people in what would become known as his fireside chats. In these chats, FDR would acknowledge the challenges of the working person. He would ask that those who felt defeated continue pushing forward, even though it wasn't going to be any easier for quite a while. Because of these broadcasts, people felt that they knew their president a little bit better, and that maybe he did understand what they were going through as well. They felt seen and heard. They recognized his voice when it came through their radio, and they listened because he brought them comfort. But on this Sunday evening, when people turned their radios on and settled in, it was not comfort they received, but absolute terror. As usual, it would take a few minutes for the whole family to get together in the living room, and by the time most turned on the broadcast, it was a few minutes after the hour. and they thought that the entertainment had just not started yet as they were treated to the sounds of Roman Racchello and his orchestra, allegedly playing from the Meridian Room in downtown New York City.
We take you now to the Meridian Room in the Hotel Park Plaza in downtown New York, where you will be entertained by the music of Raymond Racchello and his orchestra.
But after a few minutes, the voice of a news announcer cut in with a special bulletin. Over the next hour, people all over the country listened in terror as they heard what they thought was genuine and live footage of an alien invasion starting in a little town called Grover's Mill, New Jersey, and moving across the Hudson into the Big Apple.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Raymond Racchello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
Of course, we know now that New Jersey was not being invaded by aliens from Mars. It was just part of a dramatized radio broadcast, bringing War of the Worlds, the science fiction masterpiece of H.G. Wells, to life. But it seems the story was a little too lifelike for some people, and panic ensued, allegedly. The question is, how did this happen? How did even one person who was listening to a radio show about invading aliens believe that it could possibly be happening in real life? And the answer is complicated, funny at times, and very interesting. This is one of those moments in history where a perfect storm of integral people and the decisions that they made came together to create something that can never be replicated. So grab a snack, turn on the radio, and let's dive in. But first, we should have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Audible. With Audible, you can always find the perfect title for whatever you're doing, wherever you're going, or whatever you're feeling. Now, like you, I am the same person every single day, but I'm not in the same mood every day, and what's going on in my head and in my life is always going to dictate and guide the audiobook I'm listening to that day. Whether I'm looking for a really great true crime or history book, or I'm feeling like that's maybe a little bit too heavy and I want to lighten up with a good fictional mystery or romance, Audible has it all. Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment all in one place. And at Audible, you can find the largest selection of audiobooks as well as original entertainment from top celebrity creators and thousands of binge-worthy podcasts. With an Audible membership, you can download titles and listen offline anytime, anywhere. The Audible app is free and can be installed on all smartphones and tablets, and you can listen across devices without losing your spot. I do want to mention the Audible app is so intuitive and so easy to use. I love that if I'm listening to Audible at night, I can set a timer so that I don't get too far ahead in the book. I like that I can change the speed of the narration so I can speed it up or slow it down. I love that I can make bookmarks, or if I'm using an audiobook for work, I can actually make notes in that specific part of the audiobook and come back. It is an incredibly helpful and useful app. Now, Audible members get 1 credit every month, and that's good for any title in their entire premium selection. And then these titles are yours to keep forever in your Audible library. And you don't have to worry about losing your credits if you don't use them right away, because you can keep your credits for up to a year, and then you can even use them to binge a whole series at once if that's what you're into. I also love that if you use your credit for an audiobook and then you decide that maybe that audiobook isn't what you were looking for, you can swap it out for another title, no questions asked. And with an Audible membership, you will also get full access to Audible's Popular Plus catalog, which is filled with tons of stuff, including original entertainment, guided meditations, workouts so you don't have to go to the gym, sleep tracks for better rest, and ad-free versions of your favorite podcasts, and tons of audiobooks. I think people don't realize there is tons of audiobooks that you don't have to pay extra for or use a credit for in the Audible Plus library. So, for instance, today we're discussing the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast, But if you've never read the original War of the Worlds novel by H.G. Wells, you can listen to it for free in the Audible Plus catalog. And that's crazy to me because it is one of those great classic novels. So I feel like I'm kind of like getting away with something, not having to use one of my credits or paying extra for it. And this is what really makes an Audible membership so valuable. There's so much to discover that goes beyond their premium audiobooks. But what I was happy to use one of my Audible credits for was the audiobook Catherine the Great, Portrait of a Woman by Robert K. Massey. I love history. I love learning about the badass women throughout history. And this Catherine the Great audiobook, it's amazingly written, first of all. I've been listening to it every night at bedtime. It's the perfect bedtime story because it feels like fiction. It's so interesting, so exciting. It's funny at times, but also the narrator is one of the best I've ever heard. He reads this book flawlessly. He does like different intonations for voices and things. I love it, but he doesn't go like too hard where it's like almost a caricature. It's very, very good. I've had this audiobook for over 2 years, probably longer actually, probably over 3 years. It was one of the first I downloaded with Audible, and I have had to come back to listen to it at least half a dozen times because it is that good. And even if you aren't into history and you just appreciate a well-told story, you will love this audiobook. And right now, new members can try Audible for free for 30 days. All you have to do is visit audible.com/stephanieharlowe or text Stephanie Harlowe to 500-500. When you're finished watching this video, you should head over, start your free 30-day trial with Audible, and listen to War of the Worlds. It is the perfect spooky October title to put on while you're decorating for Halloween or carving pumpkins. I think the whole family will get a kick out of it. It does get scary at times, but it's just so good. Once again, go to audible.com/stephanieharlowe or text Stephanie Harlowe to 500-500. Thank you so much to Audible for sponsoring today's video, and let's dive in. Some people believe that the 1938 radio broadcast of War of the Worlds was a disaster. Many people agree that it caused chaos, and a lot of people think it was brilliant. I'm one of those people. Just to get my biases out of the way, I am a person who thinks it was brilliant. And I suppose if you were looking for one person to hold responsible for the disastrous, chaotic, and brilliant War of the Worlds broadcast, it would be Orson Welles. Now listen, if I could choose two famous people to meet who have passed away, it would be Ernest Hemingway and Orson Welles, because they both lived their lives unapologetically, and they understood the importance of a story well told. And they both could be a little extra at times, most of the time. Ernest Hemingway was just a very interesting person. If you ever want me to do a series of videos on his life, I mean, the guy had like 20 concussions in his life, okay? He lived. He lived. Let me know in the comments section. But you will never convince me that Ernest Hemingway and Orson Welles were not geniuses. And Orson Welles was likely one of the most interesting and brilliant minds of our time. George Orson Welles was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin on May 6, 1915 to Richard Welles and Beatrice Ives. Richard Welles was reportedly an inventor, a successful businessman, a gambler, and a drunk, and Beatrice Ives was a lifelong musician, concert pianist, activist, and reportedly a sharpshooter as well. The family moved to Chicago when Orson was 3 years old, and his mother, who was sure that her young son was a child prodigy, exposed him to the finest music, art, and theater that the city had to offer. And in a lot of ways, Orson Welles was a child prodigy. Even if much of his childhood achievements have been exaggerated, something that he himself admits freely with much amusement, and usually not even exaggerated by him, but exaggerated by people who were interviewed about him. Orson Welles was almost like an urban legend, and everybody would later want to say that they knew him and that they had known him before he was famous, and they would tell these exaggerated and huge stories about him, even though he was already an exaggerated and huge figure to begin with. He didn't need any more exaggeration. But from a very young age, like 4, 5 years old, Orson Welles played the violin and the piano beautifully, encouraged and sometimes pushed by his mother, who doted on him and treated him like a little adult at the same time. Sadly, when Orson was just 9 years old, his mother died from hepatitis, and he was left with a distracted father who was often at the bottom of a bottle. Now, it was when his mother died that Orson put down his musical instruments and picked up paintbrushes.
My mother, who was a professional musician, died when I was 9, and I stopped playing immediately. It's a kind of traumatic shock from her death, combined with, I think, essential laziness, the delight of not having to go on doing those scales, and abandoned my career in music. That's what I was supposed to be destined for. I was spoiled in a very strange way as a child, because everybody told me from the moment I was able to hear that I was absolutely marvelous. I never heard a discouraging word for years, you see. I didn't know what was ahead of me. I painted and they said, nobody's ever seen such painting, you know. I played, nobody's ever played like that. And it just seemed to me no limit to what I could do.
At the age of 11, Orson began attending the Todd School for Boys in Woodstock, Illinois, where he dazzled the headmaster there and his teachers with his natural artistic and theatrical abilities, and within no time he was put in charge of the school plays. Not only did Orson act in the plays, but he also directed the other students, he wrote scripts, he designed costumes, and he created sets. A fellow student of Welles said, quote, "The theater was totally Orson's. It was a one-man band," end quote. At the age of 16, Orson left school and the United States to travel to Ireland and paint, and for an entire summer he traveled around on a cart pulled by a donkey, painting during the day and sleeping under the cart at night. But when the weather became cooler, Orson headed to Dublin, where he found himself at the Gate Theatre watching a play. Now, Orson Welles was never a shy person, not when he was a kid or a teenager or a grown man, and he ended up talking his way backstage, and once there he convinced the Gates co-founder, Hilton Edwards, that he was 19 years old instead of 16 years old, and that he was already an established and famous stage actor in New York City. None of this was true. He was 16 years old, and he'd never been on a professional stage in his life, but he was also a good actor, and he was able to convince a professional adult man that he was basically a famous Broadway actor. Now, even at 16, Orson was tall, standing at over 6'2", but he had a baby face that always made him appear younger than he actually was. So he had to do a lot of acting to convince everyone that he was an adult.
That's why I smoke a cigar. I got cigars and smoked them that day in order to look older, and kept the cigar in order to seem like an older actor. In fact, I played mostly old parts in Dublin.
Yes, and then in America too, when you went back to America the year
Well,
after.
yes, because there were no parts for anybody with such a baby face.
And he was good on the stage. He was so good. He had a presence that no one could ever put into words, although many have tried. Orson Welles was the kind of actor who, within moments of watching him, you would believe he was actually the character he was playing. He had this almost innate ability to pull you with him, out of reality and into the story. You weren't just watching, you were in it with him. So, within no time, Welles did make it to New York City, and he joined an American theater company. One reviewer wrote of him, quote, "Although he is physically graceless offstage, pudgy, and unathletic, his size and booming voice gave him an authoritative stage presence." End quote. Pudgy? Come on, he was adorable. I have a little confession. Big time crush on Orson Welles. Young Orson Welles, old Orson Welles, any Orson Welles. I would take him. Adorable. But it was this booming voice and his ability to express a million subtle emotions through that voice that brought Orson his most lucrative career opportunity, which was radio. At first, he freelanced for several networks, and for years, audiences listened to multiple characters, sometimes multiple characters in the same show, not knowing that each one, although different and unique, were voiced by the same man. His most famous role was that of the Shadow, the dramatic crime-fighting hero of the radio world.
The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
Next week, same time, same station.
In 1935, a 19-year-old Orson Welles teamed up with producer John Houseman, who was 10 years his senior. Together, they worked on a play with Welles as the lead. And by 1936, they were creating and performing plays together for the Federal Theater Project, which was a government program that employed nearly 15,000 actors, directors, writers, designers, and stage techs who would present plays for affordable prices to a Depression-era audience. But Welles and Houseman were known for pulling no punches and being equal opportunity critics. So, when a few of their plays were politically driven and encouraged things like unions, they were promptly fired. Also, I didn't write this into my script, but fun fact, before Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton, Orson Welles actually put on a Shakespearean play with all black actors. He said he wanted to give the black actors a chance to perform something where they weren't token characters or where they weren't, being made fun of, essentially, where they were serious actors. And when they performed this play, the standing ovation went on for so long and they kept asking for more and more curtain calls that eventually the actors just stayed on the stage and they stopped dropping the curtain. And I think it went on for something like 15 minutes. I have goosebumps. So magical, so beautiful. Orson Welles. Now, Welles and Houseman would go on to begin their own theater company after getting fired from the government, and they named it the Mercury Theater. And within no time, the Mercury Theater, Orson Welles, and the actors were renowned. And this landed Orson Welles on the cover of Time magazine in May of 1938. But he was wearing full stage makeup and a costume, so he looked like, an old guy. So the world knew the name Orson Welles, but they didn't really know what he looked like. But this publicity for Orson Welles and his theater company, it prompted the CBS radio network to offer Welles his own weekly radio program where he would present one-hour dramas based on familiar novels and stories. And Welles brought in his partner in the theater, John Houseman, to produce and to write, as well as many actors from the Mercury Theater to perform in different voice roles. On July 11, 1938, the Mercury Theater performed its adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and in the following weeks they would perform other classics such as Jane Eyre, Treasure Island, Julius Caesar, and A Tale of Two Cities. With Houseman writing the scripts and producing each week, the music for the program was compiled and sometimes even composed by Bernard Herrmann of CBS, who conducted a 27-piece orchestra during each live broadcast every week. That's crazy. And of course, there were the sound effects. Without the technology we have today and with a limited budget, radio producers had to get creative with sound to add texture to radio shows. A large, thin sheet of copper would be suspended on wires in the studio, and whenever it was moved, it would sound exactly like thunder. And according to author Gal Jarrow, the Mercury Theater cut a cabbage in half with a cleaver to mimic the sound of the guillotine for the performance of the Count of Monte Cristo. And they would flush toilets to make it sound like oars were going in the water. Very cool stuff. By August of 1938, CBS was advertising Welles' radio show as the brightest sensation of the drama season. And when October rolled around, Welles knew that he wanted to do something spooky for the last week of the month, his very own Harloween, if you will, and so he chose a science fiction novel called War of the Worlds to recreate for the show that would air the night before Halloween. But Orson didn't want to just tell the story. He wanted to pull the audience into it with him. He would later say, quote, "I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening and would broadcast in such a dramatized form as to appear to be a real event taking place at that time rather than a mere play." End quote. But of course, there's still a difference between making it seem like a real event and doing the most to convince people that it actually is a real event. And that's an important difference here. Instead of just telling the story of War of the Worlds, the Mercury Theater would present it to the country in the form of what appeared to be news broadcasts, interrupting regular programming, something that America was already familiar with. In 1932, the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby was announced as a special bulletin during regularly scheduled programming, as was the May 1937 explosion of the Hindenburg, and Hitler's occupation of Austria in March of 1938. So basically, Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater Company wanted to present War of the Worlds to America in the form of, news broadcasts, as if it was actually happening. But there was an introduction at the beginning of the hour, when the radio program started, to let people know that they were listening to a dramatized production.
Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
But then Orson Welles himself goes into a very spooky and bone-chilling monologue, inspired by the actual introduction in the War of the Worlds novel.
Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theater and star of these broadcasts, Orson Welles.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. We know now that as human beings busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacence, people went to and fro over the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space. Yet across an immense ethereal gulf, minds that are to our minds as ours are to the beasts in the jungle, intellects, vast, cool, and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. In the 39th year of the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment. It was near the end of October. Business was better. The war scare was over. More men were back at work. Sales were picking up. On this particular evening, October 30th, the Crosley service estimated that 32 million people were listening in on radios. Not much change in temperature. A slight atmospheric disturbance of undetermined origin is reported over Nova Scotia, causing a low-pressure area to move down rather rapidly over the northeastern states, bringing a forecast of rain accompanied by winds of light gale force.
Then his voice fades out to what seems to be a benign and run-of-the-mill weather report. So if you were listening to the first 3-4 minutes of this broadcast, you would know this was a dramatization. It's a radio show based on, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and now we're getting into it. But if you turned on the radio like 5 minutes in, you might not know that. And Orson Welles changed the original story. He modernized it. The original novel was written by Herbert George Wells, who we all know as H.G. Wells, and for the record, is of no relation to Orson Welles. Their names are even spelled differently. It's just a coincidence. But before H.G. Wells was a science fiction writer, he was a science teacher, and he actually published some biology textbooks. So he was very interested in science, scientific evidence, things like that. And today, H.G. Wells is known as the Shakespeare of science fiction due to the brilliant and enduring novels that he wrote, such as The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau. And in 1897, Wells published The War of the Worlds in serialized form in Pearson's Magazine, and then Pearson's Magazine was in the UK, and the United States liked it so much, they picked it up and they put it in the Cosmopolitan magazine. So at first it was put in like magazines in serialized format every single week or every month whenever the magazine came out, and then he actually compiled all of that and put it into a novel, which we know as The War of the Worlds. Now, the events in The War of the Worlds are told to us by an unidentified male narrator and his brother, and it all started in 1894 when Mars was closer to Earth than it had ever been before. and observatories all around the world began seeing flashes of light coming from the surface of the red planet. Our narrator spots these flashes of light himself from an observatory in Surrey, England, and he brings it to the attention of his friend, who also happens to be an astronomer, and the astronomer tells our narrator that the chances of life on Mars are 1,000,000 to 1. The flashes of light coming from Mars continues for several nights until one morning, a bright light believed to be a falling star or a meteor of some sort appears in the sky over England, and it makes impact with the Earth near our narrator's home in Maybury. The narrator obviously goes to the crash site, where he finds a group of people gathered around a large metallic cylinder in a sand pit. Eventually, the cylinder begins to open, and inside is a hideous Martian. Basically, just a large head that the narrator describes as, quote, a big, grayish, rounded bulk, the size perhaps of a bear, was rising slowly and painfully out of the cylinder. As it bulged up and caught the light, it glistened like wet leather. The whole creature heaved and pulsated convulsively. A lank, tentacular appendage gripped the edge of the cylinder. Another swayed in the air, end quote. Like I said, it was a real-life Martian, and suddenly there were flashes of light as the Martian began to incinerate everyone and everything around it with its laser beams. More cylinders began to land on Earth. The Martians and members of the human military began to fight, but the humans were outmatched in forms of technology, because the Martians have lasers and heat rays. Oh, and did I forget to mention giant metallic fighting machines? The fighting machines were enormous, towering metal tripods higher than a house with the ability to move quickly over long distances, destroying everything in its path. The human beings had no chance. Now, the Martians were there to take over our world because their world was dying, and they began to move from the countryside towards London, releasing poisonous black smoke over the entire city and causing a massive evacuation of people fleeing from the path of the invading army of aliens. Now, even if you haven't read this book, the story probably feels familiar to you because maybe you've seen the 2005 Steven Spielberg film starring Tom Cruise, and I believe that movie was narrated by Morgan Freeman because I remember the opening credits, and that definitely was Morgan Freeman's voice. I loved that movie. I saw it in the movie theaters back in the day, and it was so exciting. It was like one of those films, a film that feels like a real film. It feels like a sit in the movie theater and watch it kind of film.
My favorite thing about the movie is it feels like a movie. It feels like a real go to the theater film movie.
Now, there's a good chance some of you haven't seen that movie. Some of you haven't read the book. Some of you have no idea what the story is about. And because of that, I am going to withhold telling you the twist because although this book was written, over 100 years ago, it is really a great book and a great story. And I don't want to spoil it for you in case you want to check it out for yourself. So there's a great twist in there. Don't spoil it in the comments, guys. Classic novels like this one should be experienced organically. So H.G. Wells was very creative, but like I said, also very scientifically minded, and he was intrigued by some astronomers who at that time were theorizing that there could be life on Mars. William Herschel, the English astronomer who had discovered the planet Uranus, he actually proposed that the environment on Mars would be able to support intelligent life. And in 1877, Giovanni Schirpelli, an Italian astronomer, he observed a dense network of linear structures on the surface of Mars, which he called canali. Now, the word canali in Italian means channels, but his term was incorrectly translated by the scientific community in America into canals because it looks like the word canals. For no other reason than it looks like the word canals. They could have gotten an Italian to English dictionary, but instead they were like, canali? It's either a dessert or canals. So I think he means canals because there's definitely not cannolis on Mars. Now, as we know, canals on the planet Earth are dug by humans. They're man-made. So a lot of people, including scientists and stuff, they took this to mean that if there were canals on Mars, they had to have been dug by someone, which would be like people or beings living on Mars. Enter American astronomer Percival Lowell, who devoted his personal fortune and energy to studying Mars in order to prove that the red planet held life. He built an entire-ass private observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, and he claimed to have seen the canals on Mars through his own telescope. Lowell claimed that Mars was inhabited by a civilization that was far more advanced than Earth's, and he even took it one step further, claiming that the oceans on Mars had dried up, which is obviously why the Martians had built the canals, and maybe the planet Mars was not in such great shape. And this actually prompted H.G. Wells to be like, well, what if Mars is dying and the people living there, or the Martians living there, they need a new planet, and what if they came to Earth? According to a January 1898 interview with H.G. Wells, he claimed that one day he and his brother had been walking and discussing the effect of an artillery bombardment on a village in the South Seas, and Wells had asked his brother, quote, "How would it be with us if some creatures of a vastly superior power came down upon us and behaved like a drunken man-of-war's crew let loose among gentle savages?" End of quote. So basically, what would happen if aliens came down to Earth and they weren't friendly? You know, what would happen if they wanted our planet and they really didn't need us to be here to inhabit our planet? What would that look like? What kind of panic would ensue once humans realized they were no match for these Martians and their advanced technology? We would flee, we would run, there would be people crowding the streets, you know, very Walking Dead-esque, just tons of cars packed in, you know, people trying to leave Raccoon City and they can't get out, and just people jumping from buildings rather than being, you know, at the mercy of these horrible Martians who have this poisonous black gas and these heat rays that can just incinerate you in a second. Now, the novel War of the Worlds had been written during a time of peace and prosperity, and it was welcomed by people from all over the world as a fun form of entertainment, a what-if sort of thought experiment. However, when Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater did their own version of the alien invasion story, the world and America were much different. Between financial instability at home and insecurity overseas, people were on edge. People were really scared. Basically, they were scared that at any moment there's going to be another world war. And I mean, they were right. They didn't know they were right at the time, but they were right. They were worried that at any moment maybe another natural disaster like the hurricane would hit, or, you know, another stock market crash. Like, they were in such bad places mentally, financially, emotionally, that one more horrible event was just going to push them over the edge. And they were ready to believe that anything was possible because they'd already lived through so much. And to be fair, also, the people of 1938 were vastly different than the people of 2022. Today, we have our finger on the pulse of all the information from one corner of the world to the other. We've got social media and news outlets that let us know when things are happening in real time, and we can also see others react and discuss these events as they happen. So we get multiple different viewpoints. We have a communal ability to discuss how believable these news stories are. And of course, as there was then, there are now people who will just believe everything they read or everything they hear on the news. But most people, I think, have a healthy dose of skepticism, and we can see others discussing, like, I don't know how much I believe this, or I don't know how true that is. I'm going to have to wait for more information. And because of that, you know, we are also very skeptical of everything, because we definitely don't live in a time where we can trust everything we hear or read. And we've been burned so many times by fake news and misinformation spread to further one narrative or the other. We don't know what to believe half the time, but we know we need to see things with our own eyes these days to believe in them. We have to do our own research. We have to figure things out for ourselves. And because Orson Welles and his theater wanted to put on a truly amazing performance, they did certain things to make it seem even more realistic. Instead of the alien invasion taking place in London, as H.G. Wells had written it, Orson brought the aliens to the East Coast, a rural town about 50 miles from New York City called Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Scriptwriter Howard Cook was brought in, and on Orson's instruction, he added eyewitness accounts and interviews. He made the news bulletins seem more real, basing them on news reports he had heard himself during the Hindenburg explosion, which had also coincidentally happened in New Jersey. And an actor named Kenny Delmar was hired by Wells because it was sort of well known that Kenny did an impeccable FDR impression. And this was tricky because the White House and the radio broadcasting networks had made a deal, kind of an unspoken deal with each other, that the president's voice should not be imitated on the radio just to avoid any confusion or issues. You know, the people of the country had grown used to hearing Roosevelt's voice during his fireside chats, and without being able to see the person behind the voice, they might just assume that anyone who sounded like him was him. Now, during the broadcast, Kenny Dalmar was technically voicing the Secretary of the Interior. But when he asked Welles for some acting notes, like, how do you want this to sound? How do you want this to go? He claims that Orson Welles winked at him and said, "Oh, Kenny, you know what I want." That little rogue, Orson Welles. Always up to something. So understand, if you were a normal average person listening to the radio that night, and maybe you didn't tune in until a few minutes past the hour, you would have missed the initial introduction announcing that it was a production of War of the Worlds put on by Orson Welles. You would have tuned in and you would have heard music playing like usual. And then you would have heard a special news bulletin breaking into the music announcing that a Professor Farrell at a Chicago observatory had just spotted several flashes of light on the surface of Mars. Flashes of light that looked like explosions of incandescent gas. Now, you might not think too much of it at that point. You might be wondering, why was it important enough to interrupt the lovely music? But then the music would come back and you'd move on. But then another news bulletin would break in and another, and all of a sudden you're listening to an interview with a well-known astronomer, Professor Richard Pearson at the Princeton Observatory in New Jersey. Now, Professor Pearson in real life was voiced by Orson Welles, and he scoffs at the idea that Mars is inhabited.
We are ready now to take you to the Princeton Observatory at Princeton, where Carl Phillips, our commentator, will interview Professor Richard Pearson, famous astronomer. We take you now to Princeton, New Jersey.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Carl Phillips speaking to you from the observatory at Princeton. I'm standing in a large semicircular room, pitch black except for an oblong split in the ceiling. Through this opening, I can see a sprinkling of stars that cast a kind of frosty glow over the intricate mechanism of the huge telescope. The ticking sound you hear is the vibration of the clockwork. Professor Pearson stands directly above me on a small platform, peering through the giant lens. During this period, he is in constant touch with the astronomical centers of the world. Professor, may I begin our questions?
Any time, Mr. Phillips.
Professor, would you please tell our radio audience exactly what you see as you observe the planet Mars through your telescope?
Nothing unusual at the moment, Mr. Phillips. A red disk swimming in a blue sea. Transverse stripes across the disk.
In your opinion, what do these transverse stripes signify, Professor Pearson?
Not canals, I can assure you, Mr. Phillips. Although that's the popular conjecture of those who imagine Mars to be inhabited. From a scientific viewpoint, the stripes are merely the result of atmospheric conditions peculiar to the planet.
Then you're quite convinced, as a scientist, that living intelligence as we know it does not exist on Mars?
I should say the chances against it are 1,000 to 1.
And yet, how do you account for these gas eruptions occurring on the surface of the planet at regular intervals?
Phillips, I cannot account for it.
So the listener would be lulled into a false sense of security. The professor doesn't seem to think anything is wrong. After all, he's smart. He's a professor. But then, Professor Pearson receives a telegram from the National History Museum in New York.
Professor Pearson has passed me a message which he has just received. Professor, may I read the message to the listening audience?
Certainly, Mr. Phillips.
Ladies and gentlemen, I shall read you a wire addressed to Professor Pearson from Dr. Gray of the Natural History Museum, New York. Quote, 9:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Seismograph registered shock of almost earthquake intensity occurring within a radius of 20 miles of Princeton. Please investigate. Signed, Lloyd Gray, Chief of Astronomical Division. Unquote. Professor Pearson, could this occurrence possibly have something to do with the disturbances observed on the planet Mars?
Hardly, Mr. Phillips. This is probably a meteorite of unusual size, and its arrival at this particular time is merely a coincidence.
Now, something that you also might not have picked up on as a listener in 1938, sitting cozy in your favorite armchair, is that the message Professor Pearson received reported an explosion about 20 miles from Princeton, New Jersey, at around 9:15 p.m. Eastern Time. At that time, if you were listening from the East Coast, it was only about 10 minutes after 8 p.m. So if you were, actually listening for comprehension, you'd be like, oh, this must be fake because it's only like 8:10 p.m. here. And they said that, this telegram came in at like 9:15. So this can't be true. Or maybe you would just think that they'd misspoke. It was a mistake, and you would continue listening as if you thought it was actually happening, and these were actual news broadcasts. The music would continue. Maybe you're getting a little bit anxious now, wondering what's going on. Why do these news broadcasts keep breaking in? I'm on edge right now, which was kind of the point. Those were the technical and dramatic effects that were used in order to keep people a little bit anxious, biting their nails, maybe on the edge of their seat, as any good storyteller or actor would do. Professor Pearson says that the explosion in New Jersey was not connected to the explosions being seen on Mars, but it does seem like an uncanny coincidence, right? You might move to the edge of your seat as the soothing music of the orchestra picked back up. You're almost expecting another news bulletin at this point, and it comes in the form of a special bulletin from McGill University in Canada, where a professor has just witnessed 3 separate explosions on Mars, and then another news bulletin out of Trenton, New Jersey hits.
Now, nearer home, comes a special bulletin from Trenton, New Jersey. It is reported that at 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton. The flash in the sky was visible within a radius of several hundred miles, and the noise of the impact was heard as far north as Elizabeth. We have dispatched a special mobile unit to the scene, and we'll have our commentator, Carl Phillips, give you a word picture of the scene as soon as he can reach there from Princeton.
Luckily, Carl Phillips was able to get from Princeton, New Jersey to Grover's Mill within minutes, and he brought Professor Pearson with him. And they're able to describe this object they see that has crashed into the Earth, which turns out wasn't a meteor at all, but instead a large metallic cylinder. And you can hear a crowd gathering in the background, and they're chattering, and these are sound effects done in the studio. But if you were listening on the radio, you would think, wow, these people are really outside staring at a metal cylinder, and there's a whole group of people gathering around also staring at this metal cylinder.
What I can see of the object itself doesn't look very much like a meteor, at least not the meteors I've seen. It looks more like a huge cylinder. Has a diameter of, what would you say, Professor Pearson?
What's that?
What would you say, what's the diameter of this?
About 30 yards.
About 30 yards. The metal on the sheath is, well, I've never seen anything like it. The color is sort of yellowish white. It's curious. Spectators now are pressing close to the object in spite of the efforts of the police to keep them back. Getting in front of my line of vision. Would you mind standing one side, please, while the police are pushing the crowd back? Here.
And then, while they're live on the radio, the cylinder begins to open, and absolute chaos ensues.
Now, we're not more than 25 feet away. Can you hear it now? Professor Pearson?
Yes, Mr. Phillips.
Can you tell us the meaning of that scraping noise inside the thing?
Possibly the unequal cooling of its surface.
I say, do you still think it's a meteor, Professor?
I don't know what to think. The metal casing is definitely extraterrestrial. Not found on this Earth. Friction with the Earth's atmosphere usually tears holes in a meteorite. This thing is smooth, and you can see its cylindrical
Just a minute.
shape.
Something's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is terrific. This end of the thing is beginning to flake off. The top is beginning to rotate like a screw, and the thing must be hollow.
He's moving! Keep back there! Keep back there! Keep those men back! Keep back there! Keep those idiots back! Take off! The top's loose! Look out there! Stand back!
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone's calling someone or something. I can see coming out of that black hole 2 luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost... Good heavens, something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one. They look like tentacles to me. Oh, yeah, I can see the thing's body. Now it's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but that face,
And then the fire comes, followed by destruction and death.
Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
Listening at home, you would have, by now, thrown yourself out of your seat. Your jaw would be dropped. Your hand would be covering your open mouth. You don't know whether to wait for more news or panic. But the next urgent breaking news report lets you know that maybe it's time to panic.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been handed a message that came in from Grover's Mill by telephone. Just one moment, please. At least 40 people, including 6 state troopers, lie dead in a field east of the village of Grover's Mill, their bodies burned and distorted beyond all possible recognition. The next voice you hear will be that of Brigadier General Montgomery Smith, commander of the state militia at Trenton, New Jersey.
I have been requested by the governor of New Jersey to place the counties of Mercer and Middlesex as far west as Princeton and east to Jamesburg under martial law.
You have just been listening to General Montgomery Smith, commanding the state militia at Trenton. In the meantime, further details of the catastrophe at Grover's Mill are coming in. The strange creatures, after unleashing their deadly assault, crawled back in their pit and made no attempt to prevent the efforts of the firemen to recover the bodies and extinguish the fire. The combined fire departments of Mercer County are fighting the flames which menace the entire countryside. Professor Pearson has been located at a farmhouse near Grover's Mill, where he has established an emergency observation post. As a scientist, he will give you his explanation of the calamity. The next voice you hear will be that of Professor Pearson, brought to you by direct wire. Professor Pearson.
Of the creatures in the rocket cylinder at Grover's Mill, I can give you no authoritative information either as to their nature, their origin, or their purposes here on Earth. Of their destructive instrument, I might venture some conjectural explanation. For want of a better term, I shall refer to the mysterious weapon as a heat ray. It's all too evident that these creatures have scientific knowledge far in advance of our own.
Luckily, Professor Pearson, a.k.a. Orson Welles, was able to find shelter in a nearby farmhouse, but our dependable news reporter, Carl Phillips, is found among the charred, dead bodies. Many people in areas of the East Coast would have begun looking out their windows at this point, searching the skies for lights and searching the ground for beams from Martian heat waves. They didn't see anything, but the news reports were still flooding in.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. Incredible as it may seem, both the observations of science and the evidence of our eyes lead to the inescapable assumption that those strange beings who landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars. The battle which took place tonight at Grover Mills has ended in one of the most startling defeats ever suffered by an army in modern times. 7,000 men armed with rifles and machine guns pitted against a single fighting machine of the invaders from Mars. 120 known survivors. The rest strewn over the battle area from Grover's Mill to Plainsboro, crushed and trampled to death under the metal feet of the monster, or burned to cinders by its heat ray. The monster is now in control of the middle section of New Jersey and has effectively cut the state through its center. Communication lines are down from Pennsylvania to the Atlantic Ocean.
And then the somber voice of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt crackled through the speakers.
At this time, we take you to Washington for a special broadcast on the national emergency. The Secretary of the Interior.
Citizens of the nation, I shall not try to conceal the gravity of the situation that confronts the country, nor the concern of your government in protecting the lives and property of its people. However, I wish to impress upon you, private citizens and public officials, all of you, the urgent need of calm and resourceful action. Fortunately, this formidable enemy is still confined to a comparatively small area, and we may place our faith in the military forces to keep them there. In the meantime, placing our faith in God, we must continue the performance of our duties, each and every one of us.
So I don't really know what happened here. I guess people just heard Washington and they didn't hear that it was the Secretary of the Interior speaking, and combined with the spot-on FDR imitation done by Kenny Delmar, people thought that the president was actually addressing them about an alien invasion. And it was at this point that the president of CBS, William Paley, got a call at home telling him that people all over the country were panicking. They thought the broadcast was real. They thought that Martians in metal fighting machines with heat waves were taking out entire armies, and now, going forward, leaving the countryside and heading into New York City. Reportedly, this news reached Orson Welles in the studio as he was doing the broadcast. And they were like, you have to stop. People are freaking out. People are jumping out of their windows. People are fleeing their homes. People are running over each other, trying to escape the East Coast. Our phone lines are blocked. The police are overwhelmed with, emergency calls. You've got to stop. And reportedly, Orson Welles was like, listen, I'll give a quick reminder that this is a dramatic broadcast, but I'm not stopping. The show must go on. Now, according to the newspapers of the day, the broadcast caused a massive panic all over the country. On October 31st, the Journal-Times said, quote, thousands of persons in every part of the country believed last night that the eastern United States had been invaded by creatures from the planet Mars, but it was not limited to the east. In Indianapolis, an unidentified woman ran down the main aisle of St. Paul's Episcopal Church crying, "The world is coming to an end." The congregation was hastily dismissed. In Toledo, 3 persons fainted at telephones while trying to call police. In Chicago, police reported that several persons ran out of a restaurant without finishing their meals. In Salt Lake City, residents packed their belongings and were only dissuaded from fleeing their homes by proof that it was all just entertainment. But in the East, in the country being subjected to the invasion, hysteria ran riot. Several persons came forward to swear they saw the rocket land and strange creatures climb out of it. In Newark, New Jersey, hundreds fled from 2 city blocks carrying what possessions they could snatch up in their flight. Police cars screamed through the streets of a score of towns responding to frenzied alarms. New York police reported that they had handled thousands of calls even while the program was on air. Newark, Jersey City, Trenton, Philadelphia, and other cities within close range of the focal point of the invasion were equally swamped, end quote. That was what the newspapers were printing the day after this happened, and then within the following days and weeks, everything just got far more dramatic. Now, all of a sudden, it wasn't thousands of people who panicked. It was millions of people, and people jumping from, the top floor of high-rise buildings and all sorts of just insane stories. And Orson Welles, when he finished the broadcast on October 30th that evening, he had to rush right from the studio to his theater because he had a rehearsal for a play that the Mercury Theater was putting on. And he was told, you're basically a murderer. You guys murdered a bunch of people. You made people believe that this was real. And now everything that happened is your fault. It's a result of the broadcast. And he was kind of like, I don't believe this. This cannot possibly be true. But he just went on. He went on to his rehearsal. He worked all night. And then the next morning, he was interviewed and reporters talked to him and they asked him questions. And I'm going to play some clips from that later because I think that his responses were, very telling. And also, I think very genuine. He was truly surprised. He had not expected this. He wanted people to believe it, but he wanted people to believe it in the way that you believe a scary movie when you're in a theater. You know that it's not real. You know that outside this dark theater, it's sunny and light and people are going about their business, but still, there's a part of you that's thrilled by it and that almost wants to believe it because we like to be scared in a safe environment like haunted houses, movie theaters. We like to be scared. And apparently, to put it plainly, people were scared. They were terrified, and then they were pissed off, really angry. Because I think, in my opinion, they were embarrassed that they'd been so scared. Once they found out it wasn't real, they were like, oh, I feel stupid. But to be fair, the panic and the chaos that the newspapers were reporting in the wake of the broadcast was greatly over-exaggerated, a fact that even some people today don't seem to realize. Even some major companies like PBS did a special on it, and they were saying millions of people listened and thousands of people were terrified and all of these crazy things were happening. It seems like one of those enduring myths that has continued on for so long, where it's become a part of American culture. And I don't hate it. I'm not mad about it. Yes, in reality, many people were scared. Some people even left their homes and started driving away from the New York, New Jersey area. Some people jumped on trains to get away. Not jumped on trains, they bought a train ticket, and we're like, let's get off the East Coast. But as soon as they were on the train, they were like, why isn't anyone else panicking? I thought the news broadcast said that the the communications were down and the trains weren't running anymore. But I was able to buy this ticket pretty easily, and now I'm on this train and people are just reading the paper and, chilling, and nobody seems to be freaking out. And at that point, they put two and two together. And then they were like, this is awkward. Now, of course, many people in other areas of the country called their relatives on the East Coast to, see if they were okay or to say goodbye. And then they were told, everything's okay. There's no Martians banging around and metal war machines. It's just a radio program. Many people called the switchboard, freaking out. And then the switchboard operators called the studio and they were like, what's happening? Like, what's going on? Do you have any more news about this? And the studio was like, oh, you guys thought this was real? No, this is just a broadcast. Like, it's a fake dramatized broadcast based on War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. And then the switchboard operators would get back with the people and tell them, like, don't worry, it's just fake. And then those switchboard operators would know going forward when anybody else called to just be like, don't worry, it's just a fake broadcast. However, there was one switchboard operator, I can't remember if it was North Dakota or South Dakota, who did not call the studio, who just believed it was real. And then she made it her mission to start calling everyone in the town and letting them know about the Martian invasion and that they needed to go in case they hadn't been listening to the radio. So hilarious. And once again, we might sit here in 2022 and say, yeah, idiots. Why would you seriously think that aliens are invading New Jersey and then wading across the Hudson River to wreak havoc in New York City? But to be fair again, the idea that Martians could invade the Earth was not so far-fetched in 1938 as it is in 2022, when we now have scientific proof that there is no life on Mars because, our planet's dying and we're looking for a new planet. What are the odds? How ironic. We are the Martians. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Mars was a big deal, as we've already discussed. Just they didn't know enough about it, so it was very mysterious. Like anything was possible. It's kind of cool to think that there was a time when so much was left unknown, where anything was possible. But astronomers were doing their most to prove that there was an intelligent civilization there, digging canals and waiting for their chance to make our planet their own. In 1901, Nikola Tesla claimed he was receiving radio communications from Mars. And in 1920, Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of the wireless telegraph, he claimed to have personally received signals from outer space, saying, quote, "If there are any human beings on Mars, I would not be surprised if they should find a means of communication with this planet," end quote. After Marconi said that, many other legitimate scientists around the world, from London to Sydney, they backed up his claims, and they were like, yeah, we are definitely also receiving messages from another planet. And in 1928, Dr. William Pickering from Harvard University reported seeing the canals on Mars, claiming, quote, "We can only explain them as the result of intelligent beings," end quote. And the New York Times wrote a story about Pickering's findings in 1935, saying, quote, "that there may be life on Mars is no longer denied by advanced astronomers," end quote. So in all fairness, I do understand how, a handful of people here and there would have been upset. But also in all fairness, although Orson Welles and his theater troupe were certainly very extra with the dramatics and pumping up the realness factor, there were several measures taken to directly and indirectly communicate that this was a broadcast, a fictional broadcast for entertainment and not an actual news broadcast. Although they used real cities, they didn't use real places in those cities. They didn't use the names of real experts and things like that. But once again, the population in 1938 wasn't as up to date on who all the experts were and things because they didn't have the internet. We have the internet. But also at several intervals throughout the hour, the time was read out and it was never the actual time that it was on the East Coast. And remember, when journalist Carl Phillips was interviewing Professor Pearson at the Princeton Observatory, he thanked him for the 10-minute interview, but the interview in reality only lasted, I think, roughly 3 minutes. And then Phillips and Pearson, they leave the observatory in Princeton to go to Grover's Mill, which was 11 miles away from the Princeton Observatory, which was a real place. And they are there within a few minutes. They're in Grover's Mill within a few minutes. So They must have caught a ride with one of the Martians' metal war machines to get there that quickly. But, when you're stressed out and when you think Martians are invading, maybe you're not paying too much attention to timelines and things like that. And like I already said, when Professor Pearson gets the telegram from the National History Museum, the message says there was an explosion at 9:15 p.m. Eastern Time, but it was only 10 minutes after 8 in actual time. There was also an announcement made at the beginning of the hour to tell the audience that they were listening to War of the Worlds with Orson Welles. This same announcement was made, I think, roughly halfway through the hour, and again at 40 minutes past the hour, and I believe that this is when Orson Welles was probably told to stop, and he was like, no, I'll let people know this is fake, but I'm gonna keep going. And then again at the end of the hour, thank you, you've been listening to War of the Worlds with Orson Welles. A normal intro, outro, and then a couple reminders during the hour. Now, according to Radiolab.com, about 12 million people were listening when the broadcast was on air, and about 1 in 12 people thought that the broadcast was real, and a percentage of those 1 million people ran out of their homes and panicked. However, according to Slate.com, quote, far fewer people heard the broadcast and fewer still panicked than most people believe today. How do we know? The night the program aired, the C.E. Hooper Ratings Service telephoned 5,000 households for its national ratings survey. To what program are you listening? The service asked respondents. Only 2% answered a radio play or the Orson Welles program or something similar, indicating CBS. None said a news broadcast, according to a summary published in Broadcasting. In other words, 98% of those surveyed were listening to something else or nothing at all on October 30th, 1938. The minuscule rating is not surprising. Welles' program was scheduled against one of the most popular national programs at the time, ventriloquist Edgar Bergen's Chase and Sanborn Hour, a comedy variety show. End quote. Slate, among many others, believes that the newspapers of the day seized on the opportunity of a small amount of believers who had been listening to Welles' show, and they used it to blow it out of proportion and discredit radio as a source of credible news. It was the golden age of radio, after all, and many print publications had been losing their advertisers and readership to radio. It's very similar to the way that mainstream news outlets talk down on YouTube and alternate media today, and they try to make it seem like YouTubers are out here spreading dangerous misinformation. The old is always going to have a problem with the new. Now, the old could get on board with the new, but instead they just choose to complain about how nobody watches us anymore. And to be honest, if the newspapers did this purposely to try to make radio look bad, I can understand why people didn't trust them anymore. Now, as the days went on and the weeks went on, the number of people who had called into the police increased in the papers, and they were printing that people had jumped from their windows or attempted to poison their own children so the Martians didn't get their hands on the kids. And they really focused on this one actress from New York City who had been rushed to the hospital after she'd ran out of her apartment during the broadcast and broken her arm falling down the stairs. Now, I believe that this woman was the only person hurt as a result of the broadcast. I truly believe that. Otherwise, just logically, using my head, I don't think she would have been on the cover of every paper with a sling on her arm and her sad story just, continuing to be put in the paper like day after day, paper after paper. If the papers could have found a bigger tragedy to showcase, like a person who had actually jumped out the window to their death on that night, or a person who had actually poisoned their children so that the Martians wouldn't get them, they would have put those stories in there. They would have pushed those stories on us. But, that's just my opinion. If we've got any oldies but goodies watching, if you remember this happening, or if your parents or grandparents remember this happening and they told you stories about it, let me know. Let us all know in the comment section. We'd be very interested. But one newspaper did give their own opinion in support of the broadcast, and I think it's a good one. And I think it's an opinion based in logic that can be applied today in the year 2022, or in any year for that matter. The New York World Telegram said, quote, "We don't agree with those who are arguing that the Sunday night scare shows a need for strict government censorship of radio programs. On the contrary, we think it is evidence of how dangerous political control of radio might become. If so many people could be misled unintentionally when the purpose was merely to entertain, what could designing politicians not do through control of broadcasting stations?" End quote. I mean, history has shown us that other governments around the world have done this to their own people, used the media, radio, television, newspaper as propaganda, as another arm of the government. So it's not hard to believe. Basically, the point is, no, we don't need government censorship. We just need to be smarter ourselves, right? We don't need government censorship because then they can choose what we hear. No, of course, nobody wants to be scared by an alien invasion, but we also have the opportunity to utilize critical thinking, to look outside our window and make sure there's no Martians out there, to, ask around or call in and find out for ourselves that it wasn't real, as many people did. But then when they found out it wasn't real, they felt stupid and they got mad and they wanted heads to roll. So basically, don't believe everything you hear from any source, even me. Take responsibility for what shapes your opinions and beliefs and do your own research. Fact check, validate, learn for yourself. That's what the people of Grover's Mill, New Jersey did, the village where the alien invasion started. When they heard on the radio that Martians were landing in their own backyard, they looked outside and they were like, no, it's not. No Martians here. Let's go back to dinner, They realized it was just an entertainment broadcast. Paul Ligeti, head archivist of the Historical Society of West Windsor, said, quote, "At the time, this was almost all farmland. There were only a few trees. The view would have been more than a mile. All anyone had to do that night was look out a window and see that nothing was going on," end quote. Although it does appear that a resident or two of Grover's Mill did get nervous and they allegedly shot at the old wooden water tower, believing that it was a Martian fighting machine. And there's also a well-known picture of Grover's Mill resident William Duck. And this picture was in Life magazine. And then it was all over all the magazines and all the newspapers. And it's basically William Duck holding a rifle. And the magazine claimed he was protecting his home from the Martians during the broadcast. But the picture was taken in broad daylight. And it's more likely that Mr. Duck was protecting his home and his village from the hordes of reporters and looky-loos that had descended on the sleepy town, because within days, thousands of people were pulling up into Grover's Mill, trying to check it out for themselves and, trying to get people to tell them it was horrible and they were scared. And I don't think that the reporters got what they wanted from Grover's Mill, so they had to make stuff up. I mean, Grover's Mill, these were country people, man. They're like, first of all, I ain't got time to listen to the radio at night, so I didn't even know anything was happening. And if I was listening to the radio, I looked outside and there was no Martians and I went back to my life. What's wrong with you city people? Get the hell out of here. Now, the War of the Worlds broadcast, it did get some backlash, of course. And remember, when I told you at the start of Harloween in our very first episode that I'd been researching one of the Harloween cases on the airplane when I was flying back from the Bahamas, and I was laughing so loud, my husband had to tell me to be quiet, it was this one. I was reading this amazing book, Spooked: How a Radio Broadcast and the War of the Worlds Sparked the 1938 Invasion of America by Gail Jarrow. It's an extremely informative book. It's got lots of great pictures in it. That's a picture of H.G. Wells and Orson Welles. How cool. So it's a really good book. I highly suggest that you check it out if you're interested in learning more, because there's real life experiences of people who thought that the broadcast was real, but then they realized quickly that it wasn't, and then they felt dumb. But I got to a section where there's excerpts from letters, angry letters that were sent to Orson Welles and the FCC from pissed off citizens. And I cracked up, man. When I was reading them, I was dying. Like I said, I understand why they might have thought it was real for a minute or a little bit. And I understand why they might have felt foolish when they realized it wasn't. But at that point, you just have to laugh at yourself and move on. However, this is a reality of people. People are going to be people. So many times when people feel foolish or they're embarrassed, it turns into anger, and then they need to get their pound of flesh. They need to wag their finger at someone, because someone has to pay for the negative emotion that they were forced to feel against their will. And, this is, I think a lot of people who don't have a ton of emotional intelligence, or who don't have a ton of coping skills, or who don't have a real handle on their emotions, whenever they feel an emotion they don't want to feel, like sadness, fear, vulnerability, they turn it into anger, because that's the only emotion that feels productive to them at that point. The other emotions feel shameful. And I can say this because I was like that for a very, very long time. So I completely understand it. But some of these letters, man, had me rolling. About 1,400 of these letters that were sent to Welles, they still exist in the archives, but only 10% of them were negative. So MZ from New Jersey writes, quote, "If what I think of you would ever take effect, it would burn you to a cinder, hoping never to hear from you again," end quote. EB from Indiana writes, quote, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Well, I'll not tell you what I'm thinking because you would probably have me arrested," end quote. Yeah, you sound like a good person. MJ from Illinois said, quote, "You have made radio a medium of deception, which if allowed to continue could make radio a menace," end quote. MM from Oklahoma said, quote, "Perhaps if you'd put on your little play 50 years ago, it would have been a joke. But the way science has progressed in that time, surely nothing is impossible," end quote. And they signed it scorchingly. So basically, because science has progressed and technology, and there could be something out there, we can never talk about it because it will scare you if we talk about something that could possibly be true or happen. Make it make sense. And then my personal favorite from GH in California, quote, "I think the safest place for you is Mars. Take a rocket and get going. Nuts to ya," end quote. Orson Welles had a lot of supporters, though, who, to be honest, mirror my thoughts. And some of these people are able to laugh at themselves, like HLS and AWH from Denver, Colorado, who said, quote, "It's a good thing that we have strong hearts, otherwise we would have been dead from fright. We hate to admit it, but the acting was simply superb," end quote. Now, those are my kind of people. Those are cool people. They live in Denver, of course. And MH from the Bronx, New York, said, quote, "Despite the fact that the neighborhood as a whole is instituting a mass movement to string you to a tree, rest assured that you have a few faithful backers. Perhaps the nation needs to be embarrassed by its own ignorance once in a while," end quote. And then Mrs. S. from Michigan said, quote, "These mollycoddled jitterbugs show what they're made of, just a bunch of crybabies." R.I. from Ohio said, quote, "All this goes to illustrate the low mentality of the average listener. They do not see 1/10 of what they read. They must not listen to 1/2 of what they hear," end quote. And then EC from Connecticut said, quote, "Don't people think anymore? My God, what the propagandist of the next war can do," end quote. And then DOG from Indiana said, quote, "It shakes one's faith in democracy to think that such hysteria and panic can affect people who are supposed to vote intelligently next week," end quote. And then one of my favorites, PVW from New Jersey said, quote, "The infernal machines passed within a few blocks from my house, and I didn't think to step outside to see them. After New York was destroyed, we all went to bed," end quote. See, these people have a sense of humor. They can look at what happened, acknowledge that they were scared, acknowledge the emotion they had, feel it, let it pass, and then laugh about it instead of, turning that feeling into anger and then literally going on a witch hunt. And a lot of Orson Welles supporters who thoroughly enjoyed the tale of the Martian invasion as a pre-Halloween night treat were children. NC from Chicago, Illinois wrote, quote, "I have been chosen as a representative to tell you how sorry we all are that the people didn't like your play. Whatever happens because of your radio play, you will know that a dozen children will stick by you," end quote. Heartwarming, sweet. And I know that my guy Orson Welles appreciated it. Now, on the morning of October 31st, 1938, Orson Welles became unwittingly infamous and was thrust into the spotlight. But not the spotlight he was used to, that of a Broadway stage. He was thrust into the spotlight of a critical public eye. This was really the first time that Orson Welles would be in front of the world in this way. He was used to being on stage in full costume and makeup or behind a microphone, his voice being heard by millions, but his face remaining a mystery. And all these reporters gather around him and they're like shooting questions at him, and he kept his cool. He's unshaven. He looks exhausted because it's the day after. He left the studio after the broadcast, went right to dress rehearsal for his play. He was there throughout the night. He got no sleep. He didn't shave. I think he's wearing the same clothes he wore when he did the broadcast after he changed out of his costume. But he still handles all of these annoying reporters who it's like, yo, back up, man. Give a guy some space. Why are they crowded around him like this? It is obnoxious. I would have lost my shit. I'll tell you, I would have been throwing bows, man. But they gather around him obnoxiously, and he keeps his cool, and he answers, honestly. Not always an answer that they probably wanted to hear, because what they wanted was for him to apologize and bow down to the court of public opinion and, whatever you want, I'm so sorry, I prostrate myself at your feet. It's not what he did. He was honest. He acknowledged that he hadn't expected it. He was surprised by it, and he just told the people what he felt.
I simply don't know. I can't imagine. I mean, you must realize that when I left the broadcast last night, I went into dress rehearsal for a play that's opening in 2 days, and I've had almost no sleep, and I know less about this than you do. I haven't read the papers, except...
Were you aware of terror at the time you were giving this role? Were you aware that terror was going on throughout the nation?
Oh, no, of course not. We did Dracula, and it seemed to me during Dracula I had high hopes that people would react as they do in a movie of that kind, and I don't know that they did, particularly, and so I've given up. One doesn't believe in the radio audience much. You don't know whether they're listening or not. You have no idea how many people are listening or what they're thinking. I had every hope that the people would be excited as they would be at a melodrama, but you don't play down the melodramatic effects of a melodrama.
Mr. Wells, why did you use local towns in this book?
Well, H.G. Wells uses local towns addressing an English audience. I was addressing an American audience, so the transplantation was quite logical, it seemed to me. He doesn't use mythical towns. He uses quite real ones.
Ask it loud, very loud. Do you think, Mr. Wells, that you might have taken unfair advantage of the public in using a method as a conveyance for authentic news?
I don't believe that I have, since it is not a method original with me. It is used by many radio programs. I am terribly shocked by the effect it's had. I do not believe that the method is original with me or peculiar to the Mercury Theater's presentation.
Do you think there ought to be a law against such enactments as we had last night as a result of that?
I don't know what the legislation would be. I know that almost everybody in radio would do almost anything to avert the kind of thing that has happened, myself included, but I don't know what the legislation would be. Radio is new and we are learning about the effect it has on people. Well, every radio program tries to be more dramatic than life, as every play tries to be more dramatic than life, and every movie, not less so. I would have been surprised and hurt, as anybody would, if they'd been told that a presentation was less effective than life.
At the end of the day, the dramatic broadcast was the best thing that ever happened to Orson Welles. Within a week, the Campbell Soup Company, big time, okay? It's big time now. They offered to sponsor Wells's weekly radio show. And I think they turned it into like the Campbell Story Hour or something. I forget, but they renamed it with the Campbell name. That was a big sponsor, man, back in the day. The world could not deny that a bad actor would never have been able to pull this off. And Orson Welles was a lot of things, but he was not a bad actor. And by 1939, Orson Welles was in Los Angeles because he was literally courted by all these producers and studio heads. And at that point, he began writing, producing, directing, and starring in movies, such as the film he's most well known for, Citizen Kane, which hit theaters in 1941. And, a little tongue-in-cheek, because Orson Welles was tongue-in-cheek during the movie, Wells's character, Charles Kane, he announces, quote, "Don't believe everything you hear on the radio," end quote. That's who Orson Welles was. Very tongue-in-cheek, very unapologetic, very good-hearted, and well-intentioned, but with enough hubris to have no patience for anyone who lashed out instead of being able to laugh at themselves. Sadly, Orson Welles would die, I believe, in 1984 or 1985, and in 1988, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Grover's Mill, the town of Grover's Mill hired artist Thomas J. Warren to sculpt a war monument that would be unveiled during a 4-day celebration that included a parade and a Martian bicycle race. The Martian Landing Site Monument is a 7.5-foot-high piece of sculpted bronze, which features Orson Welles. He's talking into a studio microphone. I think he has a cigar in his hand because, he's always got a cigar in his hand. There's a Martian war machine in the background. There's people listening to a radio. It's cute, Grover's Mill, New Jersey is famous for this. They were a town that nobody would have heard of otherwise. And it's funny, the writer of the script didn't really even pick Grover's Mill. He just took a pencil and a map on the East Coast, and he like closed his eyes and put the pencil tip down, and it landed on Grover's Mill, and he said he liked the sound of it, and it ended up being perfect and working perfect. And I guess the moral of this story is relax, man, have fun. Be happy, do your homework, don't panic, and if you do panic and end up looking like a fool, laugh at yourself and move on with your life, because there will be truly terrible things that we all have to go through in this life, tragic losses and roadblocks that you didn't expect and you didn't plan for, times where life feels so hard you don't even know what to do next, and you can't always find someone to blame for it. Sometimes it just happens and you have to cope. We all have to cope with these things, and we can't make ourselves feel better by shifting these negative emotions onto somebody else. And in the spaces between these hard times, don't make mountains out of molehills. Lighten up, enjoy life, take every opportunity to smile and laugh, make fun of yourself, love your family. You will be happier, I promise. Just don't take yourself so seriously. Too many people take themselves so seriously. And what is the saying going? Like, don't take life too seriously, you won't get out alive. Yeah, basically that. That is all I have for you guys today. Let me know what you thought in the comments section. If you are interested in this, I definitely suggest reading War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells or listening to it on Audible. Also, pick up this book. I got it on Amazon. I think it's amazing. I love it. I will read this over and over again. It's just a very good book, and there's lots of sources at the back, which is why I was able to find so much information, because I just sort of followed these sources. Besides it being full of information, it's full of really cool, beautiful pictures that honestly I couldn't find anywhere else. I hope I'll be able to get them into this video maybe. We'll see. But yeah, great book. Check that out. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We have a lot of people watching who aren't subscribed. Harloween's really going well. I'm so happy with it. I hope you guys are too. So subscribe if you want to see more. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. Send this to your parents if you're, kind of my age, because my mom remembered this happening. I'm not sure if she just heard it from her mom or if she was alive at the time. I don't think she was alive at the time. Was she? No, there's no way. But anyway, she probably heard about it, but she was really interested in the story. So send it to your parents. Like the video if you liked it, and don't forget to follow me on social media. Twitter and Instagram handles are in the description box, as well as the links to my podcast, Crime Weekly, that I co-host every week with retired police detective Derek Levasseur. You can listen wherever you get your audio podcasts, or you can watch on our YouTube channel. I really want to thank everyone for being here with me for Harloween. I'm having a good time. I hope you are too. Thank you so much for all your support, all your kind words, all your funny comments in the comment section. I'm always in the comment section. I love interacting with you guys. I really appreciate it. So leave me a comment on this one. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and stay spooky. And I will see you next time. Bye.